Submarine Summit for Australia took place on the 25th and 26th of March in Adelaide this year. The summit was held to discuss and also to inform the public about the Collins-class submarine and Australia's shipbuilding capabilities. On the first day of the conference, the Defence Minister, Kevin Andrews, stressed the importance of the Defence White Paper, which is due out later this year, as well as addressing Australia's submarine needs. Opposition leader Bill Shorten took advantage of the audience filled with experts in the field to unveil the Labor Party's plans for a bipartisan approach to the future submarine program.
I've outlined Labor's proposed process and made it clear our objectives. A competitive tender delivering value for money, an Australian build and Australian maintenance drawing on local expertise and supporting local jobs, investing in our strategic capability and the skills of our workforce. And the time to get this moving is today. We cannot afford to drift or delay any longer. This decision is bigger than day-to-day politics. It's too big a question for partisan pride. So if, by some crooked twist of fate, the government brings Labor's proposed process to the Parliament under a different name, with attribution and acknowledgement to the government, I simply don't care. It is the idea that matters, not an argument about the authorship. In fact, I will be the first to vote for it. My concern isn't about whether or not Liberal or Labor get the credit. We've got plenty of other things to argue about. It's about solving this problem. We cannot wait around for a second attempt at an intergenerational decision, merely in the hope of getting our name in the parliamentary record book. Finding a way forward is more important than all of this. The next generation of Australian submarines do not belong to Liberal or Labor. They belong to the nation. They belong to the Australia of 2025 and the Australia of 2050. I sincerely hope that Australia, the Australia of our future, people could look back at this summit and this day, the 25th of March 2015, and say this is when Australia put aside partisan competition and got on with delivering the next generation of submarines. They could say that this was the day that the country set itself up for the future in a bipartisan fashion. We can, we should, we will.
After this announcement, we were also able to talk to several of the speakers and key observers during this summit. I spoke to the Honourable David Feeney about why it is so important that the submarines be built in South Australia or even Australia.
We need to have the capability not only to build them but to repair them and sustain them and of course crew them. That needs to happen with the support of Australian industry, and that's a very big undertaking. We say to the Abbott government that the proposal that submarines be built overseas means that you start to lose submarines as a sovereign capability, and you put at risk the fact that your nation loses the ability to build or sustain or repair them. If we were in the position of only being able to do marginal maintenance on the submarine, then, and if we were forced to rely on foreign shipyards for more significant work, then it would become ever more challenging for Australia to maintain this very important military capability. So we say there are good strategic and capability reasons for why the submarine should and must be built here in Australia. The fact that that's the case does of course mean that there are big opportunities for Australian industry and there are big opportunities for our engineers and for our workforce. The heartening thing, of course, is that we have seen over the last 50 years Australia and Australian industry rise and meet those challenges, both in building the original Collins-class boats in the 1990s and early part of the 2000s, and then in sustaining those boats ever since. So we know we have the people, we know we have the expertise here in this country, and we can continue to have the ambition of being the parent navy of our own unique submarine and being and having those submarines as a part of an Australian enterprise where Australia can be confident that it owns and operates a capability that it can rely on.
Mm-hmm. And the opportunity that we have to ask the other, there was the policy in the policy, Bill Shorten mentioned that we would ask for tenders from Japan, France, Germany and Sweden, and we'd still hopefully obtain the intellectual property rights of the submarines. I mean, is that something that you're advocating for more than having it designed in Australia? Yes,
we know that the next generation of submarines will mean that Australia needs to find an international partner that can bring its own designing expertise and experience into an Australian-led framework. There are a number of countries that have indicated they're very keen to do that. France is one, Sweden is one, Germany is one, and obviously there's been a lot of public comment around that kind of collaboration with Japan. So that international partnership is something that I think both sides of politics recognise would be required, but it doesn't change the fact that Australia would need to be the owner of all the intellectual property that flowed from that work, and that we would need to be confident that it was a sovereign capability for Australia.
Mm-hmm. And finally, you've got a keen interest in submarines. Is there something that you would like us to be seen doing for the defence with submarines?
Well, I think the challenge with our submarine capability is that there's very little awareness in the policy debate or in the broader community about just what an extraordinary accomplishment they have been by Australians for Australia. They are quite literally remarkable achievements, and we have seen them really represent an achievement that is again and again being denigrated by the conservative side of politics and all too often by our newspapers. And so there's been very little recognition for what we've achieved. That, of course, has led to something of a cringe and has meant that it's been all too easy for people to speculate about taking this industry away from Australia and having our submarines built in other shipyards, an idea that on any rational assessment is ludicrous and is only able to be sustained in the public debate because there's too little appreciation for what a remarkable thing Australians have done already.
After giving his speech at the summit, Minister for Defence Industries in South Australia, Martin Hamilton-Smith, spoke to us about why it's so important for the submarines to be built in Australia and indeed in South Australia, as well as his thoughts on the Labor Party's announcement.
Look, I think it's very important that we build submarines and surface ships for our Navy here in Australia, particularly with the transformation going on in our economy with Holden closing, low value, high volume, low margin manufacture. For example, the car industry is struggling, but high value, high margin, low volume manufacturing like naval shipbuilding is the pathway forward. So it is extremely important that we build these naval ships here. The state government of South Australia is of the view that the federal government is on the wrong track, bidding out submarine work on the basis that the ships and submarines might be built overseas or in some hybrid model where half of them are built overseas and half here. In our view, that's wrong. We should mandate that the submarines be built in Australia and provide a continuity of work over 30 years for both submarines and surface ships that ensures we have competitive world-class shipyards that are highly productive. In that way, we'll have an efficient, cost-effective shipbuilding industry, and we'll not only be building our defences, we'll also be building our nation.
And what are your thoughts on Labor's new policy towards the ships, submarines being built here?
Well, I welcome Mr Shorten's announcement today. He, first of all, instead of just criticising from the sidelines, has put out an alternative plan and an alternative pathway forward. And I think that's a wonderful thing for an opposition to do. Secondly, he's offering bipartisanship if the federal government will agree to a starting point, which is that the submarines be built in Australia. I think if the federal opposition, the alternative government, and the government, the coalition, could agree on that fundamental point, that we will build the submarines here, then the rest would fall into place rather quickly. while the coalition is insisting that we consider building submarines overseas, there will be a lack of bipartisanship. Australians don't want it, business doesn't want it, workers don't want it, and I think at heart the Navy don't want it either. We have a Navy that should expect that its own country can maintain its ships, repair its ships, upgrade its ships, refit its ships when needed, and a Navy which is not dependent on another country for its survival and its sustainment. If we can get to that starting point, which Mr Shorten offered this morning, then I think there's a pathway forward, and I commend him for suggesting it.
One of the audience members for the Submarine Summit was the Liberal leader for South Australia, Stephen Marshall, and we were able to talk to him quickly about what his thoughts on the Labor Party's new announcement were.
Well, it's of course a changed position. We had Senator Feeney talking about their position prior to the last election, which was for option 3 or 4, a new design or an evolved Collins. And we also heard the Leader of the Opposition, Bill Shorten, telling us that they weren't really viable options, and in fact what we needed to do was to go out to open tender. Look, the federal government is of course considering what they call a competitive evaluation. My concern regarding Bill Shorten's comments were that he said that we need to slow the entire process down. South Australia is heading towards a real valley of death in terms of work here in South Australia, and I think that quite frankly we would like to be making this decision certainly before the end of this year.
Past CEO of the ASC, Steve Ludlum, was asked about his opinion on the new policy ideas from the Labor Party's opposition leader.
It was interesting to see the current government's policy and then the opposition's suggestion. And the most depressing aspect of that, really, is that there's no bipartisan relationship between the two. And I think the sooner the two of them can actually decide on what their best plan is, the better. I'm not going to choose which one, but certainly there's only going to be one. And whilst there's two, they'll be fighting one another, and that will just slow the whole programme down.
Mm-hmm. And in your talk today, you mentioned stuff that we've already spoken to you about. But just to reaffirm what your talk was about today, would you just give a brief summary?
Well, the really brief summary is that industry is performing really well here in Australia. That's the broad aspect of industry, and it should be given a fair go to be part of the future submarine programme. And moreover, we should do the vast majority of the work here in Australia because that will be the most cost-effective way of doing it. I didn't speak to the economics, others will speak to that. I didn't need to do that. I just know that by building them here, we'll understand them far better, we'll be able to maintain them better, we'll be faster at doing it, there'll be great excitement about what we're doing, there'll be lots of innovation, and the more we do it, the better we'll be doing it, and the costs will come down quite markedly, and we'll have high levels of reliability and availability for the Royal Australian Navy.
Because it's not that we're not capable of building them here, we certainly have the talent to do so. It's more just the cost that the government is worried about when it comes to building in Australia?
I don't think any of us know what the cost is going to be, whether it's from a overseas nation or whether it's from us, because we're not really sure what the requirement is. But that being said, there's a perception that we will be a higher cost. There's also a perception that because we've not done it for some time that we would represent a high risk. And both of them are, the perceptions and in those people's minds are reasonable. But having spent the last 5 years, as one of the principal leaders in the industry, if not the principal leader in the industry, I don't see them in the same way. I believe that the costs would be reasonably competitive and eventually on that learning curve, extremely competitive. And I believe the risk is one that we should take because of the innovation that we built into the teams and the way that they plan different methods of doing things every day actually tells me that the risk is very, very small. So that's why I think we should do it here.
Neal James, the Executive Director of the Australia Defence Association, was also able to talk to us about his opinion on the talks at the Submarine Summit so far.
Look, what they've said made some sense. There was a plea for bipartisanship too, which I understand has already been rejected by the coalition, and that's the whole problem of the submarine debate. It's often too politicised, and there's insufficient attention paid to the long-term national interest.
What are your thoughts on what some of the speakers have said?
Look, the tragedy of it is, to an extent, that people have said what people expected them to say. There have been some great nuggets through the day from various speakers, but this is so politically sensitive that a lot of the government officials and ADF officers have to be very, very careful what they say. And this morning, of course, you have the Minister and the Leader of the Opposition and the Shadow Minister, and they pretty much said what everyone expected them to say. There have been one or two other presentations, one from a leading defence industry journalist and one from a very experienced submariner that did offer some refreshing views, and that was probably the highlight of the morning.
And what do you think Australia should do about the submarines? Should we build them here or should we look to overseas parties?
Well, it's actually the wrong question. We definitely need submarines, and we definitely need somewhere between 8 and 12, and we definitely need the best submarine. Now, once you make those decisions, you then decide how they're built and where they should be built. Unfortunately, a lot of the public debate is overly obsessed with where they should be built, rather than looking at what is actually the capability and strategic need.
A lot of the public are unsure as to why Australia needs submarines because they don't see us being in conflict anytime soon. Is there any way you could clarify for them why we would need submarines?
Well, one of the quickest ways to spot an amateur in any strategic policy debate is where someone says to you, why do we need submarines at all? I mean, let's face it, we're an island nation entirely dependent upon seaborne trade and the protection of that trade, and the Pacific and Indian Oceans are huge. And as a country with a small population but with huge strategic responsibilities, submarines provide you with the type of capability edge that minimises strategic risk over the long term. And it would be just ludicrous in the 21st century for Australia to have a defence force without any submarines.
And finally, with the afternoon talks coming up, is there anything that you're hoping to hear from our speakers?
Look, I think there'll be some more two-way discussion through the afternoon. This morning was mainly people speaking at the audience. There was some ability to answer questions, and the format of this afternoon will be a bit of a more two-way discussion, and that might move us forward a bit too.
These were just some of the highlights of the Sub Summit. More information can be found on www.subsummit.com.au.